In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a mysterious schoolmistress, Miss Eleanor Vance, arrives with secrets from her past, stirring unease among the villagers. When she's found poisoned at her desk, clutching an accusing letter, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of hidden scandals, old grudges, and a deadly lesson in truth. From a tense tea party to a shocking confession, every clue points to a past that refuses to stay buried. Will Miss Marple solve the mystery before the killer's secrets destroy more lives? Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of St. Mary Mead. The late autumn sun draped St. Mary Mead in a soft amber haze, its rays slanting through the bare branches of the ancient elms that fringed the village green. From her chintz-curtained window, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the familiar scene. The postman cycling lazily down the lane, Mrs. Price's terrier yapping at a stray cat, and the vicar's wife bustling toward the church with an armful of chrysanthemums. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, Miss Marple's keen eyes detected a faint ripple of change, like a stone dropped into a still pond. A newcomer had arrived in the village, a rare event in St. Mary Mead, where faces were as fixed as the stones in the old churchyard. Miss Eleanor Vance, a retired schoolmistress, had taken up residence at Willow Cottage, a quaint ivy-smothered house that had stood empty since old Mrs. Harrow's passing. Miss Vance was a figure of immediate intrigue, a lean, upright woman in her early 60s, with steel-grey hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, and a wardrobe of starched blouses that seemed to defy the soft contours of rural life. Her speech, peppered with Latin phrases and delivered with the precision of a metronome, had already set tongues wagging at the village shop. "She's a proper schoolmarm, that one," Miss Marple's maid, Florence, had remarked as she polished the silver. Quoted, "Mens sana in corpore sano," when I offered her a second scone at the Women's Institute. As if I'd know what that means. Miss Marple had smiled, her needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. She knew the phrase, "a sound mind in a sound body," and suspected Miss Vance's choice of it was no idle flourish. There was a deliberateness to the woman, a suggestion of depths beneath her prim exterior. Miss Marple's curiosity was further piqued that morning when Florence brought in the post. Among the usual circulars and a letter from her nephew Raymond was a crisp, cream-coloured envelope addressed in a meticulous hand. It was an invitation from Miss Vance requesting the pleasure of Miss Marple's company at a tea at Willow Cottage that afternoon. The stated purpose was to foster acquaintance with the village's more prominent residents, a formal phrase that struck Miss Marple as oddly out of place for St. Mary Mead's cosy informality. She turned the card over, noting the embossed initials EV on the flap. "A woman who likes things just so," she murmured, tucking the invitation into her knitting basket. As the clock struck 2, Miss Marple donned her best tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single velvet rose. The walk to Willow Cottage was short, but she took her time, pausing to exchange pleasantries with Mr. Pye, the florist, who was fussing over his late-blooming roses. "That Miss Vance," he said, snipping a wilted bud, "asked for Latin names of every flower in my shop. Said she'd teach the village children botany if they'd let her. Queer sort, isn't she?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A woman who taught, even in retirement, suggested a nature that could not rest idle. Willow Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its garden neat but unadorned, as if its occupant had no time for frivolities like dahlias or delphiniums. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by Miss Vance herself, her posture ramrod straight, her grey eyes appraising. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice clear and clipped, like a bell signalling the start of a lesson. She ushered her guest into a drawing room that was as orderly as a classroom, its furniture polished to a gleam, and its shelves lined with books, Livy, Virgil, and a worn copy of Cicero's De Officiis. Other guests were already present. Dr. Haydock, his ruddy face creased with good humour, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, clutching a plate of sandwiches, and Mr. Ridley, the bank manager, whose pomposity seemed slightly deflated in Miss Vance's presence. A younger woman, Lucy Bell, hovered near the tea tray, her delicate features taut with an emotion Miss Marple could not yet place. The conversation was polite but strained, as if each guest sensed they were being measured against some invisible standard. Miss Vance served tea with the precision of a ritual, her movements economical yet graceful. She spoke of her years at St. Agatha's School in Devon, where she had taught classics to generations of girls. Discipline, she said, her eyes glinting, is the foundation of character. Nulla dies sine linea, no day without a line. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to her own school days, where discipline had often masked less noble motives. She noted how Miss Vance deflected personal questions, turning the talk to village matters with a skill that bordered on evasion. As the tea drew to a close, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a photograph on the mantelpiece. Miss Vance, younger but no less stern, standing with a group of schoolgirls in starched pinafores. One girl, half hidden at the edge, had a face that stirred a vague memory. But before Miss Marple could study it further, Miss Vance moved to adjust a vase, obscuring the frame. "A relic of my teaching days," she said, her tone brisk. Hardly worth notice, but her hand lingered on the mantel, and Miss Marple saw a shadow pass over her face, a shadow that spoke of something unresolved. As she walked home, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Miss Vance was not merely a retired schoolmistress settling into village life. There was a purpose to her presence, a thread that connected her past to St. Mary Mead. And Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that thread would soon unravel, revealing a pattern far more complex than a simple village tea. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Willow Cottage. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Willow Cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. The air carried the faint scent of lavender polish and freshly baked scones, but the atmosphere within the drawing room was anything but serene. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-back chair near the fireplace, observed the small assembly with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, her fingers poised as if to catch not wool, but the invisible threads of tension that wove through the room. Miss Eleanor Vance, the new occupant of Willow Cottage, stood at the centre of the gathering, her posture as rigid as a schoolroom ruler. Her grey hair was drawn back into a tight bun, and her black dress, relieved only by a cameo brooch, gave her the air of a Victorian governess. She poured tea from a silver pot with a precision that suggested she had measured every drop. Her guests, an assortment of St. Mary Mead's more prominent residents, sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to veiled discomfort. Dr. Henry Haydock, the village physician, lounged in an armchair, his ruddy cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire. He was a man of robust opinions, often delivered with a chuckle, but today his usual bonhomie seemed tempered by a wariness Miss Marple noted in the way his eyes flicked toward their hostess. Beside him sat Mrs. Margaret Clement, the vicar's wife, her plump hands smoothing her skirt as she murmured pleasantries about the weather. Her kindness was genuine, but Miss Marple saw the faint crease in her brow, a sign that even her charitable nature sensed something amiss. Mr. Arthur Ridley, the bank manager, occupied a stiff-backed chair near the window, his gold watch chain glinting as he shifted uncomfortably. His pomposity, usually as polished as his shoes, seemed dulled in Miss Vance's presence, as if her sharp gaze stripped away his self-importance. The youngest guest, Lucy Bell, hovered near the tea tray, her delicate frame clad in a simple grey frock that did little to hide her unease. Her dark eyes darted toward Miss Vance with a mixture of deference and apprehension, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to such details, wondered at the history between them. The room itself was a study in contrasts. Willow Cottage, with its low ceilings and rose-patterned wallpaper, should have been cosy, yet Miss Vance's influence had rendered it austere. The bookshelves held volumes of Latin and Greek texts, their spines uncracked save for a few well-worn copies of Ovid and Tacitus. A single photograph adorned the mantelpiece, a younger Miss Vance surrounded by schoolgirls, their faces blurred by time and shadow. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, sensing it held a key to the woman's past. But she refrained from comment, her instinct warning her to wait. Miss Vance, having ensured each guest had a cup of tea, took her place at the head of the room, her hands folded primly in her lap. "I am delighted," she said, her voice clear and authoritative, "to make the acquaintance of St. Mary Mead's most esteemed residents. My years at St. Agatha's School in Devon taught me the value of community, and I hope to contribute to this one." Her words were polite, but there was a formality to them, a rehearsed quality that Miss Marple found curiously impersonal. Mrs. Clement, eager to fill the silence, smiled warmly. "We're so pleased to have you, Miss Vance. It's not often we get someone with your experience in our little village. Do tell us about your teaching days." Her tone was encouraging, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of Miss Vance's lips, as if the question were an intrusion. "I taught classics," Miss Vance replied, her eyes scanning the room. "Latin, Greek, the foundations of a disciplined mind. Mens sana in corpore sano, as Juvenal would have it. My pupils were girls of promise, though not all rose to meet it." Her gaze rested briefly on Lucy Bell, who flushed and looked down at her teacup. The moment passed quickly, but Miss Marple filed it away, sensing a story behind the glance. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his voice hearty but cautious. "Classics, eh? Fine stuff, though I confess my Latin's a bit rusty. All that amo amas, amat business went out of my head years ago." He chuckled, but the sound fell flat, and Miss Vance's smile was thin, almost reproving. "Discipline," she said, "is a skill that endures beyond conjugation. I hope to offer lessons to the village children, Latin, perhaps, or literature. Education is never wasted, even in a place as charming as St. Mary Mead." The word charming carried a faint edge, as if she found the village's simplicity wanting. Mr. Ridley, adjusting his spectacles, spoke up, his tone pompous, yet unsteady. "A commendable endeavour, Miss Vance, though I dare say our local school does well enough. My own daughter benefited from a fine education, though not, I believe, at your St. Agatha's." His words were meant to assert authority, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his tea. She wondered if his mention of his daughter was deliberate or a slip. Lucy Bell, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice soft but strained. "Miss Vance was a wonderful teacher. Strict, but inspiring. She made us think about more than just lessons." Her words were meant as a compliment, but there was a hesitancy in them, and Miss Marple saw Miss Vance's eyes narrow, as if assessing the sincerity behind the remark. The conversation turned to village matters, the upcoming harvest festival, the state of the church roof, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the undercurrents. She sipped her tea, her mild blue eyes moving from face to face. Mrs. Clement's chatter was too bright, as if covering her discomfort. Dr. Haydock's joviality seemed forced. Mr. Ridley's usual bluster was muted, and Lucy Bell's nervous glances suggested a past that weighed heavily on her present. As the tea progressed, Miss Vance announced her intention to tutor local children in Latin, free of charge, as a way to give back to the community. The proposal was met with polite murmurs, But Miss Marple sensed little enthusiasm. The villagers, she knew, were wary of outsiders imposing their ways, and Miss Vance's air of authority did little to endear her. Yet Miss Marple wondered if the schoolmistress's plan was less about charity and more about purpose, a purpose tied to her abrupt arrival in St. Mary Mead. The photograph on the mantelpiece drew Miss Marple's gaze again. She rose, ostensibly to admire a vase of late roses, and positioned herself to study the image more closely. The schoolgirls, in their starched uniforms, stood in neat rows, but one face at the edge caught her eye, a girl with sharp features and a defiant tilt to her chin. The face was familiar, though Miss Marple could not place it. Before she could linger, Miss Vance stepped forward, her movements swift and deliberate, and adjusted the frame so the photograph faced the wall. "An old memento," Miss Vance said, her voice cool. "Of little interest now," but her hand lingered on the mantel, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or resolve, in her grey eyes. The moment was fleeting, but it confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Miss Vance was not merely a retired teacher seeking a quiet life. She was a woman with a past, and that past had followed her to St. Mary Mead. As the guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help clear the tea things. Miss Vance declined with a polite but firm smile, and Miss Marple took her leave, her mind buzzing with questions. The walk back to her cottage was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the promise of frost. She thought of the photograph, the tension in Lucy's eyes, and Mr. Ridley's unease. People, she reflected, were like her knitting. A single drop stitch could unravel the whole pattern, and Miss Vance, she suspected, was a woman with many such stitches hidden in her past. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. She thought of Miss Vance's Latin maxims, her guarded manner, and the photograph she had so quickly concealed. "Nulla dies sine linea," Miss Marple murmured, recalling Miss Vance's words. No day without a line. But what line, she wondered, was Miss Vance drawing in St. Mary Mead? And who, or what, was it meant to ensnare? As the fire crackled and the village settled into its evening hush, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the gathering at Willow Cottage. It had been a simple tea, yet she felt the stirrings of something deeper, something that would soon disrupt the quiet of St. Mary Mead. She picked up her needles, her mind as sharp as the steel in her hands, ready to unravel the mystery that Miss Eleanor Vance had brought to her doorstep. Chapter 3. A Troubling Discovery. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a veil of silver, as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves, but a hush had settled over the usual bustle of the lane. News travelled swiftly in a village, and by the time Miss Marple reached the post office, the whispers had already begun. Miss Eleanor Vance, the schoolmistress of Willow Cottage, was dead. The tidings reached Miss Marple through Mrs. Price, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper ears. "Found this morning she was," Mrs. Price said, leaning over the counter, her eyes bright with the thrill of calamity. "Slumped at her desk, poor soul. Lucy Bell went to call on her and nearly fainted at the sight. Dr. Haydock says it's poison, cyanide, if you can believe it." Miss Marple nodded, her face composed, though her mind was already turning over the details like a gardener inspecting new soil. By noon, Willow Cottage was a hive of activity, cordoned off by the local constable as Inspector Craddock. A young man with a methodical air and a respect for Miss Marple's insights took charge. Miss Marple, invited to the scene under the guise of offering neighbourly support, stood quietly in the corner of Miss Vance's study, her eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. The study was as orderly as Miss Vance herself, its shelves lined with books arranged by subject and its desk free of clutter save for a single sheet of paper, a pen, and a glass of sherry, now tinged with a sinister significance. Miss Vance lay slumped in her chair, her grey hair still neatly pinned, her face serene, but for a faint grimace that suggested her final moments had not been peaceful. The air held a trace of something bitter, like burnt almonds, and Dr. Haydock, standing beside Inspector Craddock, confirmed the cause of death. "Cyanide," he said gruffly. "In the sherry, most likely. Quick, but not pleasant." Inspector Craddock, his notebook open, frowned at the scene. "No signs of a struggle," he said, almost to himself. "And no one heard anything last night. The front door was unlocked, but that's not unusual in the village." He glanced at Miss Marple, who stood with her hands folded, her mild expression belying the sharpness of her thoughts. "Miss Marple, you were at her tea yesterday. Did anything strike you as unusual?" Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering a minor point of etiquette. "Miss Vance was a precise woman," she said softly, "not one to leave things to chance. Yet she seemed guarded, as if she carried a burden she was not ready to share." Her eyes drifted to the paper on the desk, where a few words were scrawled in Miss Vance's meticulous hand. "I know what you did, and I will not stay silent." The sentence ended in a smear of ink, as if her strength had failed mid-thought. Craddock's brows rose. A letter, perhaps. But to whom? He examined the paper, careful not to touch it. No address, no signature. It's as if she was interrupted. He turned to the sherry glass, now in the hands of a constable for analysis. The poison was in the drink, no doubt about it. But who gave it to her, and why? Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a blotter, its lock glinting in the morning light. "That diary," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "might tell us more. Miss Vance was a woman who kept records, I suspect." Craddock nodded, but the key was nowhere to be found, and the diary remained sealed for the moment. Lucy Bell, who had discovered the body, sat in the drawing room, her face pale and her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. Miss Marple, with her knack for soothing distressed souls, sat beside her, offering a cup of tea from the thermos Mrs. Clement had brought. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "it must have been a dreadful shock. Can you tell me what happened?" Lucy's eyes, red-rimmed, met Miss Marple's. I came to see her this morning," she stammered. "She'd asked me to call, said she had something to discuss. When I arrived, the door was ajar, and I found her like that." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her handkerchief. Miss Marple patted her hand, noting the girl's trembling fingers and the way her eyes avoided the study door. Inspector Craddock, joining them, pressed gently. "Miss Bell, you knew Miss Vance from her teaching days, didn't you? Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might have wished her harm?" Lucy shook her head, but her hesitation was palpable, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the glance she had seen pass between them at the tea, the look of a pupil who feared her teacher's judgment. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, where the late roses still clung to their stems. She thought of the letter, its accusatory tone, and the locked diary. Miss Vance had come to St. Mary Mead for a reason, she was certain, and it was not merely to teach Latin to village children. The photograph from the tea, with its half-hidden face, lingered in her memory, as did Mr. Ridley's unease and Lucy's nervous deference. "People," Miss Marple murmured, "are never quite what they seem, are they?" She returned to the study, where Craddock was overseeing the removal of the sherry glass. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but tinged with frustration, "this feels like a puzzle with too many pieces missing. No fingerprints but hers on the glass, no signs of forced entry, and no obvious motive. She'd only been here a few weeks." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the diary. "Sometimes, Inspector, The past follows us, even to a place as quiet as St. Mary Mead. I wonder if Miss Vance's last lesson was meant for someone here. She paused, her mind sifting through the faces at the tea. Perhaps we should speak to the others who were there yesterday. People reveal more than they intend when they're caught off guard. Craddock agreed, and as the police prepared to question the village, Miss Marple made her way home, her steps slow but purposeful. The mist was lifting, revealing the familiar outlines of St. Mary Mead, but the shadow of Miss Vance's death hung heavy. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she pondered. The letter, the diary, the photograph, all were threads in a tapestry she could not yet see. But she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the truth lay hidden in the ordinary, waiting for her to unravel it. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green as Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting a soft blur of pale blue wool in her hands. The news of Miss Eleanor Vance's death had spread like wildfire, and the village hummed with speculation, each whispered theory more fanciful than the last. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet demeanour and unerring instinct for human nature, sought the truth not in gossip, but in the subtle details that others overlooked. Her morning had been spent in discreet inquiries, conducted with the tact of one who knew the value of a well-placed question over a cup of tea. She began at the vicarage, where Mrs. Margaret Clement was arranging flowers for the church, her hands trembling slightly as she snipped stems. "Such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Clement said, her voice hushed. "Miss Vance seems so formidable. Who could have wanted her gone?" Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the vicar's wife's unease and gently probed. "Did she ever speak of her life before St. Mary Mead, my dear? A woman like that must have had stories to tell." Mrs. Clement frowned, her fingers pausing over a chrysanthemum. "Not much, I'm afraid. She mentioned her school, St. Agatha's, wasn't it? But nothing personal, though—" She hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple. "There was talk, you know, when she left. Something about a scandal, though no one seems to know the details. I heard it from Mrs. Price, who heard it from her cousin in Devon." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. A scandal, even a whispered one, was a thread worth following. Her next visit was to Dr. Henry Haydock, who was in his surgery, sorting through patient files with a distracted air. The doctor, usually jovial, was subdued, his ruddy face creased with concern. "A bad business, this," he said, offering Miss Marple a chair. "Poison's a nasty way to go. I saw Miss Vance a week ago. She came in complaining of sleeplessness, said she was troubled by old matters but wouldn't say more." He shook his head. "She struck me as a woman carrying a weight, Miss Marple. Not the sort to share it, though." "Did she mention anyone in particular?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild as she adjusted her shawl. "A name, perhaps, or a place." Haydock rubbed his chin, thinking. "Not directly, though she did say something odd, about debts that must be paid, in this life or the next. I took it for a figure of speech, but now—" He trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the shadow in his eyes. Debts, she thought, could mean many things: money, guilt, or revenge. Her final call was to Lucy Bell, who lived in a small flat above the village shop. Lucy was pale and jittery, her dark eyes shadowed as she invited Miss Marple in. The room was modest, with a typewriter on a rickety table and a few books stacked neatly beside it. Miss Marple, settling into a worn armchair, offered a sympathetic smile. "You've had a terrible shock, my dear," she said. "Finding Miss Vance like that. It must weigh on you." Lucy's hands twisted together, her knuckles white. "It was awful," she whispered. "She was just sitting there as if she'd fallen asleep, but her eyes—" She shuddered, and Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch as soothing as her voice. "You knew her well, didn't you? From your school days, I believe? Lucy nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. She was my headmistress at St. Agatha's. Strict, but she made you want to be better. She never forgot anything. Not a lesson, not a mistake. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She wrote to me recently, Lucy continued, almost reluctantly. Asked about my life in London, my work. It felt strange, like she was looking for something. Something? Miss Marple prompted gently, her knitting needles still in her lap. Lucy bit her lip, then shook her head. I don't know. She didn't say. But she was different here. Not like the teacher I remembered. More determined, I suppose. Miss Marple noted the choice of word, filing it away with the other fragments she had gathered. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind sifting through the morning's conversations, the scandal in Devon, the sleeplessness, the cryptic talk of debts. It all pointed to a past that Miss Vance had brought with her to St. Mary Mead. The locked diary, still in Inspector Craddock's possession, loomed large in her thoughts. With his permission, she had arranged to view it that afternoon, and as she made her way back to Willow Cottage, her steps were brisk, despite the chill in the air. The cottage was quieter now, the police presence reduced to a single constable guarding the door. Inspector Craddock met her in the study, where the diary lay on the desk, its lock pried open by a locksmith. Not much to go on, Craddock said, flipping through the pages. It's full of initials and dates, no names. She was careful, I'll give her that. He handed the diary to Miss Marple, who turned the pages with delicate precision. The entries were written in Miss Vance's meticulous hand, each line as orderly as a lesson plan. Most were brief, noting appointments or observations about the village, but a recurring phrase caught Miss Marple's eye. The truth must be taught. It appeared multiple times, often followed by initials, LB, AR, CW, and dates stretching back years. One entry, dated a week before her death, read, CW must face the consequences. The lesson is overdue. Miss Marple's lips pursed. CW was a clue, but to what? She closed the diary, her mind turning to the photograph she had seen at the tea. The girl at the edge, half hidden, had a face that nagged at her memory, and she wondered if CW was connected to that image. Inspector, she said, her voice soft but clear. Have you spoken to Mr. Ridley about his daughter? I believe she attended St. Agatha's during Miss Vance's time. Craddock's eyes sharpened. Ridley? He didn't mention it. Said his daughter was educated abroad, I think. He made a note, his respect for Miss Marple's instincts evident. I'll have a word with him, and Lucy Bell. She's hiding something, I'd wager. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the tension she had observed at the tea. Lucy's unease, Mr. Ridley's discomfort, the photograph's swift concealment, all were pieces of a puzzle that Miss Vance's death had brought into sharp relief. People, she said almost to herself, carry their pasts like shadows. Sometimes those shadows cast a very long reach. As she left Willow Cottage, the village was settling into its evening routine, the lights in the cottages glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving together the threads she had gathered. Miss Vance had come to St. Mary Mead with a purpose, she was certain, and that purpose had led to her death. The diary, the letter, the photograph, they were all part of a lesson she had meant to teach, a lesson that someone had been desperate to silence. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly as she pondered. The truth, as Miss Vance had written, must be taught. But to whom, and at what cost? Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her gentle smile, were fixed on the answer, hidden somewhere in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Secrets. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's drawing room as she sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm that belied the whirl of her thoughts. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay under a blanket of evening mist, its cottages huddled against the chill of late autumn. The village was still reeling from Miss Eleanor Vance's death, and though the police were methodical in their inquiries, Miss Marple knew that the truth often hid in the small, overlooked details of human behaviour. Her morning had been spent piecing together the fragments of Miss Vance's past, and now, as the clock ticked towards 7, she felt the threads of the mystery beginning to form a pattern. Her first task had been a discreet letter to an old friend, Miss Clara Hartley, who had once taught at a school near St Agatha's in Devon. Miss Hartley's reply, delivered by the afternoon post, was a goldmine of carefully worded information. Miss Vance, it seemed, had left St Agatha's under a cloud some 10 years prior. The cause was an incident involving a pupil, Clara Weston, who had been expelled for cheating on an examination. The accusation, Miss Hartley wrote, had been contentious. Many believed Miss Vance had been unduly harsh, driven by personal animosity rather than evidence. Clara's family, humiliated, had left Devon, and the girl herself had vanished from public view. Miss Hartley added a postscript. Eleanor was a woman of principle, but her principles could be inflexible. I always wondered if she regretted that affair. Miss Marple set the letter aside, her mind turning to the initials C.W. in Miss Vance's diary. Clara Weston, she suspected, was the key to the schoolmistress's purpose in St Mary Mead. But how did this connect to the village? Her thoughts drifted to Mr Arthur Ridley, the bank manager, whose unease at Miss Vance's tea had been palpable. His daughter, now married and living abroad, had been of school age during Miss Vance's tenure at St Agatha's. Could she be Clara Weston? To test her theory, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr Ridley's imposing house on the edge of the village. The bank manager received her in his study, a room heavy with mahogany and the scent of pipe tobacco. His usual pomposity was tempered by a nervous edge, his fingers fidgeting with a paperweight as Miss Marple settled into a chair. "A dreadful business, Miss Vance's death," she began, her voice gentle. "You were at her tea, I recall. Did you know her well?" Mr Ridley's eyes flickered, and he adjusted his spectacles. "Not at all," he said too quickly. "Met her that day, first time. Seemed a formidable woman." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland, but her eyes sharp. "Your daughter," she said, as if the thought had just occurred, "was educated at a fine school, wasn't she? In Devon, perhaps?" The paperweight slipped from Mr Ridley's hand, clattering onto the desk. "Abroad, mostly," he said, his voice strained. "She's married now, lives in Canada. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled, her tone apologetic. "Just an old woman's curiosity. Miss Vance spoke of her teaching days, and I wondered if your paths had crossed before." Mr Ridley's face reddened, and he rose abruptly, muttering about a meeting at the bank. But as Miss Marple thanked him and turned to leave, her eyes fell on a framed photograph on a side table. A young woman with sharp features and a defiant tilt to her chin, the same face she had glimpsed in Miss Vance's photograph. "A lovely girl," Miss Marple said, pausing. "Your daughter, I presume?" Mr Ridley nodded curtly, ushering her out with a haste that confirmed her suspicions. Back in the village, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing evidence at the police station. She shared Miss Hartley's letter and her observations about Mr Ridley. "I believe," she said, her voice soft but certain, "that Mr Ridley's daughter is Clara Weston. The photograph at Willow Cottage matches the one in his home. Miss Vance may have come here to confront her, or perhaps her father, about that old scandal." Craddock's brow furrowed. "That's a motive, I suppose. Resentment over a ruined reputation. But Ridley's a stuffy sort, not a murderer. And his daughter's in Canada." He tapped his pencil against his notebook. "Still, I'll look into it. That diary's been no help. Those initials could mean anyone. LB for Lucy Bell, maybe, but CW fits your theory." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to Lucy Bell, The young woman's nervous demeanour at the tea and her distress at finding Miss Vance's body suggested more than mere shock. Miss Marple decided to pay her another visit, this time at the village hall, where Lucy was helping prepare for the harvest festival. The hall was a flurry of activity, with women arranging pumpkins and tying ribbons, but Lucy stood apart, her hands idle as she stared at a basket of apples. "My dear," Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile, "you look quite lost in thought. Still troubled by Miss Vance's passing?" Lucy started, her dark eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's so hard to believe she's gone." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple guided her to a quiet corner, offering a handkerchief from her bag. "You were fond of her, weren't you?" Miss Marple said, her tone kind but probing. "Yet she seemed to unsettle you at the tea. Had she said something to upset you?" Lucy's fingers twisted the handkerchief, and she shook her head. "It was nothing, really. Just old memories. She asked about my friends from school, people I hadn't thought of in years. It felt like she was digging into the past." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "The past can be a heavy burden," she said. "Did she mention anyone in particular? A friend, perhaps, like Clara Weston?" Lucy's face paled, and she looked away, her voice barely audible. "Clara? Yes. She asked about her. I told her I didn't know where Clara was. It's been years." But her eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt, and Miss Marple noted it, her thoughts racing. As she left the hall, Miss Marple reflected on Lucy's words. The young woman had been Clara Weston's friend at St. Agatha's, and Miss Vance's questions had clearly struck a nerve. Had Lucy known more about Clara's fate than she admitted? And what of Mr. Ridley, whose daughter bore the face of the girl in the photograph? The pieces were falling into place, but the picture remained incomplete. That evening, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock at Willow Cottage, where the police had uncovered a new clue, a small key hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Cicero's De Officiis on Miss Vance's bookshelf. The key fit the diary's lock, and Craddock opened it, revealing more entries in Miss Vance's precise script. One, dated 2 days before her death, read, "CW is closer than I thought. The truth will out, whatever the cost." Another mentioned a meeting planned for the night she died, though no name was given. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words. She was preparing for something, she said quietly. A confrontation, perhaps, to right an old wrong, or to expose one. Craddock nodded, his frustration evident. But who was she meeting? And where did the cyanide come from? It's not exactly a village shop item. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sherry glass, which bore only Miss Vance's fingerprints, and the second glass, found in the kitchen, wiped clean. Someone had been with her that night, someone careful enough to leave no trace. "Inspector," she said, "we must consider those who were closest to her past. Lucy Bell, Mr. Ridley, and anyone else connected to St. Agatha's. The answer lies there, I'm certain." As she walked home through the misty lanes, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Miss Vance had come to St. Mary Mead not to retire, but to settle a score, and someone had ensured she would never finish her lesson. The shadows of the past, she knew, were long and dark, and they stretched across the village, touching lives in ways yet to be revealed. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm, and prepared to unravel the next thread in the tapestry of Miss Vance's last lesson. Chapter 6. The Final Lesson. The pale light of a November moon filtered through the curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate shadows on the walls as she sat by her fire, her knitting a soft whisper in the quiet room. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm, but the shadow of Miss Eleanor Vance's death lingered, like a frost that refused to thaw. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together the threads of the schoolmistress's past. Clara Weston's expulsion, Mr. Ridley's guarded demeanour, Lucy Bell's nervous reticence, and the cryptic entries in the locked diary. Each clue was a stitch in a pattern, and Miss Marple was determined to see it whole. Her morning began with a visit from Inspector Craddock, who arrived with a furrowed brow and a notebook bristling with notes. He settled into her armchair, accepting a cup of tea with a grateful nod. "We've traced the cyanide," he said, his voice low. "It's photographic chemical used in developing. Not common, but not impossible to get. There's a chemist in Much Benham who sold some a month ago to a young woman," he said, though he couldn't recall her face. Miss Marple's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, her needles clicking steadily as she listened. "The diary's been our best lead," Craddock continued, flipping open his notebook. "Those initials, CW, LB, AR, point to Clara Weston, Lucy Bell, and Arthur Ridley, we think. But the entries are so vague. That last one, about a meeting the night she died, mentions a final reckoning. Sounds like she was planning to confront someone." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "But who? And why poison her before she could speak?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression mild but her mind sharp. "Miss Vance was a woman of purpose," she said softly. "Her diary speaks of teaching the truth, and I suspect her final lesson was not for children but for someone whose past she held in her hands. The photograph, the letter, the cyanide, all suggest a secret she meant to expose." She paused, her eyes meeting Craddock's. "Have you spoken to Lucy Bell again? Her connection to Clara Weston seems significant." Craddock nodded. "She's been evasive, but I'm seeing her this afternoon. And Ridley, he's clammed up about his daughter. Says she's in Canada, hasn't been back in years. I've sent a telegram to confirm." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A wise precaution," she said. "But secrets have a way of hiding closer to home than we expect." Determined to probe further, Miss Marple made her way to Lucy Bell's flat above the village shop, where the young woman was typing at her desk, her face pale and drawn. The room was tidy, but cheerless, its single window overlooking the grey rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Lucy rose at Miss Marple's knock, her hands fluttering nervously as she offered a chair. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin. I didn't expect you. Is there news?" "Only questions, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle as she settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her side. "You've been through so much finding Miss Vance like that. I wondered if you'd remembered anything more. About her questions, perhaps, or why she was so interested in your old school friend Clara Weston." Lucy's eyes widened, and she sat abruptly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Clara, I told you. I haven't seen her in years. Miss Vance asked about her, but I didn't know what to say." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened as if holding back a flood. "She was persistent," Lucy added, almost in a whisper. "She said Clara had done something unforgivable and that she had to make it right." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "And did she say what that something was?" she asked. Lucy shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. "No, but she was so intense. She said she was preparing her final lesson and that it would change everything. I begged her to let it go, but she wouldn't listen." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Miss Marple handed her a handkerchief, her touch as reassuring as her voice. "You went to see her that night, didn't you?" Miss Marple said, her tone so gentle it was almost a caress. Lucy froze, her breath catching. Yes, I did," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I went to Willow Cottage, just to talk. She was in her study, writing. She said she had to teach one last lesson, to make someone face the truth. I didn't understand, but I was frightened. For Clara, for me, for what it all meant." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Lucy's admission placed her at the scene, but the wiped clean glass in the kitchen suggested calculation, not panic. "And did you share a drink with her?" she asked, her voice still soft. Lucy's eyes widened in alarm. No, I mean, she offered me sherry, but I didn't take it. I left soon after. Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted to the door. As she left the flat, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the second glass, its surface meticulously cleaned. Someone had been careful. Someone who knew the value of discretion. Lucy's fear was genuine, but was it the fear of a witness or a culprit? Miss Marple's steps were slow as she walked back to her cottage, the village quiet under the gathering dusk. The diary's mention of a final reckoning and Lucy's visit suggested a confrontation, but the cyanide pointed to a premeditated act, not a moment of impulse. That evening, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock at the police station, where he shared a new discovery. A small vial, empty but smelling faintly of cyanide, found hidden in a flower pot outside Willow Cottage. It's not much, Craddock said, but it confirms the poison was brought to the house. The chemist in Much Benham couldn't identify Lucy Bell as the buyer, but he said the woman was young, nervous. Fits her description, doesn't it? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. It does, she said, but we must be careful. Lucy is frightened, but fear can come from many sources. Guilt, yes, but also loyalty, or even love. She was Clara Weston's friend, and Miss Vance's questions about Clara clearly unsettled her. She paused, her mind turning to Mr. Ridley. Have you heard back about his daughter? Craddock nodded. The telegram came this afternoon. She's in Canada, married, hasn't been in England for years. Ridley was telling the truth there, but I still think he's hiding something. He got twitchy when I asked about St. Agatha's. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. People often hide what they fear to face, she said. Miss Vance's arrival stirred memories, and memories can be dangerous. As she returned home, Miss Marple's thoughts were on the photograph, the girl with the defiant chin, the face that matched Mr. Ridley's daughter. Clara Weston's expulsion had left a scar, one that Miss Vance had come to St. Mary Mead to reopen. But why? To atone or to accuse? And how did Lucy fit into the equation? The diary's cryptic entries, the wiped glass, the hidden vial, all pointed to a secret that someone had killed to keep buried. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room, but her mind was in the shadows, chasing the truth. Miss Vance's final lesson, she knew, was not about Latin or literature, but about justice, a justice that had cost her life. As the village slept, Miss Marple's eyes were bright, her thoughts weaving a net that would soon ensnare the one who had silenced the schoolmistress forever. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. The soft patter of rain against the windows of the vicarage filled the air as Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner of the drawing-room, her knitting needles idle for once, her sharp blue eyes scanning the small gathering she had orchestrated. The room was warm, with a fire crackling in the grate, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tensions. The pretext for the meeting was a discussion of a memorial for Miss Eleanor Vance, but Miss Marple's true purpose was to unravel the final thread of the schoolmistress's deadly lesson. She had invited the key figures from that fateful tea at Willow Cottage: Dr. Henry Haydock, Mrs. Margaret Clement, Mr. Arthur Ridley, and Lucy Bell, each seated now with varying degrees of unease. Mrs. Clement, ever the gracious hostess, bustled about with a tray of tea and biscuits, her chatter about the harvest festival, a thin veil over her discomfort. Dr. Haydock sat with his hands clasped, his usual joviality subdued, his eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. Mr. Ridley, stiff in his chair, polished his spectacles repeatedly, his face a mask of strained civility. Lucy Bell, pale and fragile, sat near the window, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked glass. Inspector Craddock, invited at Miss Marple's suggestion, stood near the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, but his presence a quiet reminder of authority. Miss Marple began, her voice gentle yet clear, like a bell ringing through the fog. "It's a sad occasion that brings us together," she said, "to honour Miss Vance, a woman of such conviction. She believed in truth, you know, and in teaching it, no matter the cost." Her eyes moved from face to face, noting the slight tightening of Mr. Ridley's jaw, the flicker of Lucy's lashes. Her diary spoke of a final lesson, one she meant to deliver here in St. Mary Mead. "I wonder, did any of you know what she intended?" Mrs. Clement shook her head, her hands fluttering. "She was so reserved, Miss Marple. I knew nothing of her plans, only that she wanted to teach the children." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "She was troubled, I could see that. Came to me about insomnia, said old matters kept her awake. But she never confided in me." Mr. Ridley said nothing, his fingers still on his spectacles, but Miss Marple saw the pulse at his temple quicken. Lucy's voice, when it came, was barely audible. She spoke of lessons, yes, but I thought she meant Latin or literature." Her words faltered, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was as sharp as ever. "Did she, my dear?" she asked. "Or was her lesson about something older, something tied to her days at St. Agatha's? A wrong she felt compelled to right?" The room grew still, the only sound the rain and the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational but deliberate. "Miss Vance's diary mentioned initials, C.W., for Clara Weston, I believe. A girl expelled from St. Agatha's under a cloud, accused of cheating. A harsh judgment, some thought, and one that changed her life." She paused, her eyes on Mr. Ridley. "Your daughter, Mr. Ridley, was Clara Weston, was she not?" Mr. Ridley's face drained of colour, his spectacles slipping from his hand to clatter on the table. That's preposterous," he stammered. "My daughter was educated abroad, as I told the inspector. She's in Canada now, married. She has nothing to do with this." But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple's gentle smile held a hint of steel. "I saw her photograph in your study," she said, "and another at Willow Cottage, half hidden but unmistakable. Miss Vance recognised her, didn't she? She came here to confront you, or perhaps Clara, about that old injustice." Mr. Ridley's mouth opened, then closed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Miss Marple turned to Lucy, her voice softer still. "And you, my dear, were Clara's friend. Miss Vance questioned you about her, didn't she? That night you visited Willow Cottage, you pleaded with her to let the past lie. But she wouldn't, would she?" Lucy's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, her voice a whisper. "I tried to stop her. I begged her. She said the truth had to come out, that Clara had to face it." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his eyes on Lucy. "You were there that night, Miss Bell. The second glass, in the kitchen, wiped clean, but it was there. Did you bring the cyanide?" Lucy's sob broke the silence, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I just wanted her to stop. Clara's happy now. She's built a new life. I couldn't let Miss Vance ruin it again." The room was stunned. Mrs. Clement gasping, Dr. Haydock staring in disbelief. Mr. Ridley's voice was hoarse. "Lucy, what have you done?" Lucy's tears fell freely now, her words tumbling out. "I got the cyanide from my cousin. He uses it for photography. I went to talk to her, to make her see reason. She was writing that letter, accusing Clara, saying she'd tell everyone. I poured it into her sherry when she wasn't looking. I didn't think. I just wanted it to stop." Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sorrow. "You thought you were protecting your friend," she said. "But secrets, my dear, have a way of poisoning more than just the one who holds them." She turned to Craddock, who nodded, his face grim as he moved toward Lucy. "Miss Bell," he said, "I'm afraid you'll need to come with me." Lucy rose, her shoulders slumped, her tears silent now. "Mr. Ridley," his face a mask of anguish, spoke at last. "I knew Eleanor was trouble," he said, his voice low. "She wrote to me, hinting at Clara's past. I begged her to leave it alone, but I never thought—" He trailed off, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "I should have told you everything, Miss Marple. I thought I could protect my daughter." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. "We all wish to protect those we love," she said. "But the truth, as Miss Vance knew, has a way of finding its way out." As Craddock led Lucy away, the room fell silent, the rain a soft lament against the windows. Mrs. Clement dabbed her eyes, and Dr. Haydock shook his head, muttering about the tragedy of it all. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. Miss Vance's final lesson had been taught, not in a classroom, but in the lives she had touched, and the secrets she had stirred. As the vicarage door closed behind her, Miss Marple stepped into the rain, her thoughts already turning to the healing that St. Mary Mead would need in the days to come. Chapter 8. A Village Restored. The rain had ceased, and a pale winter sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a tentative light on the village green. The elms, now bare, stood sentinel as the village slowly resumed its familiar rhythm, though the echo of Miss Eleanor Vance's death lingered in the hushed conversations at the post office and the subdued chatter at the Women's Institute. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision, a soft grey scarf taking shape in her hands. The fire crackled, its warmth a counterpoint to the chill that had settled over her thoughts. The arrest of Lucy Bell had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, stirring pity and shock in equal measure. The young woman's confession, wrung from her in the vicarage's tense atmosphere, had laid bare a tragedy born of loyalty and fear. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case, felt a familiar pang of sorrow for the frailties of human nature. Lucy had acted to protect her friend Clara Weston, but her desperate choice had unravelled lives in ways she could not have foreseen. In the days following, Miss Marple had kept her ear to the village's pulse, gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. A letter from Clara Weston, now Mrs. Clara Hammond in Canada, arrived at Mr. Ridley's home, its contents shared with Miss Marple over a quiet cup of tea. Clara expressed grief for Miss Vance's death and gratitude toward Lucy, tempered by horror at her friend's actions. "I was wronged at St. Agatha's," she wrote, "but I've built a new life. I never wanted this." She spoke of forgiveness for both Miss Vance and her father, and a hope to visit St. Mary Mead one day to mend old wounds. Mr. Ridley, broken by the ordeal, had confided in Miss Marple, his pomposity stripped away. "I knew Eleanor was stirring up trouble," he admitted, his voice heavy. "When she wrote to me, hinting at exposing Clara's past, I panicked. I thought silence would protect us all." Miss Marple had nodded, her eyes kind but unwavering. "Silence," she said, "is a fragile shield. The truth, however painful, is a better one." Inspector Craddock, ever thorough, had tied up the loose ends. The cyanide vial traced to Lucy's cousin confirmed her story, and the wiped glass in the kitchen spoke of her attempt to cover her tracks. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had seen the deeper truth. Miss Vance's relentless pursuit of justice had pushed Lucy to a breaking point, turning a loyal friend into a desperate killer. The schoolmistress's final lesson, it seemed, had been as much about her own inflexibility as about the secrets she sought to expose. As the village prepared for winter, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Clement at the church, helping to arrange evergreen boughs for Advent. The vicar's wife, still shaken, spoke of Lucy's remorse. "She's written to me," Mrs. Clement said, her voice soft. "Says she'll face her punishment, but she hopes Clara can forgive her. It's so sad, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded, her hands deftly tying a ribbon. "Sad, yes," she said, But there's hope in facing the truth. It's what Miss Vance wanted, in her way. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting a steady companion as she gazed out at the village green. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and grey, and the world seemed to pause in the stillness. She thought of Miss Vance, whose rigid principles had led to her undoing, and of Lucy, whose love had turned to tragedy. People, she murmured, her needles clicking softly, are so very like my knitting. One tug at the wrong thread, and the whole pattern comes apart. The village would heal, she knew, as villages do. The gossip would fade, the church would fill with carols, and St. Mary Mead would carry on. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes remained watchful, ready for the next ripple in the quiet surface of her world. She picked up her tea, her mind already turning to the small, ordinary moments where truth so often hid, waiting for her gentle touch to bring it to light.